Given the acclaim lavished on Valve's Half-Life video game franchise, fans had good reason to expect high-quality puzzle design in the short game Portal, released in 2007 as part of the Orange Box collection. But what many expected to be little more than a proof of concept, a puzzle game in which the player navigates its mazes by positioning portals on their walls, ceilings, and floors, surprised and delighted fans with its darkly comic tale of GlaDOS, an unpredictable, sadistic, and murderous artificial intelligence that seized control of a scientific facility called Aperture Science and now passes her time psychologically tormenting humans while subjecting them to hazardous testing. Portal 2, released in 2011, in part explores GlaDOS's backstory and grisly origins. Once the human assistant to the facility's founder, her personality was forcibly uploaded into Aperture's mainframe, a fact that helps to explain her two facets, the logical machine and the capricious sociopath. In these videos, we will examine 3 musical passages in Portal 2. The first video will focus on some of the compositional details of the game's title theme, revealing subtle ways that the music helps tell the game's story. The second video will take a broader view, exploring how the title theme serves as a generator for 2 other compositions, and showing how the musical principle of theme and variations not only informs the score to Portal 2, composed by Mike Moraski, but also reflects the game designer's major gameplay focus, teaching the player to succeed through iterative puzzle design. Portal 2's title theme, 9999999, helps portray the dichotomy between GlaDOS's cool mechanical logic and maniacal insanity by juxtaposing musical opposites and creating contrasting dualities. Primarily, 9999999 is a set of arpeggios over a repeated chord progression, with developing changes in orchestration throughout. The arpeggios and heavy reliance on synthesizers suggest a fiction that the music has been composed by a machine, since, given a chord progression as an input, a computer would have little difficulty composing a piece by simply arpeggiating through it over a given span of time. When I asked Moraski about this, he responded,
"My intention was not to imply that she necessarily had written it, but that it could have been written by her or maybe one of her subsystems."
In 9999999, the arpeggios spiral out of control into unpatterned subdivisions of 2-to-1, 3-to-1, and 4-to-1 with respect to the ongoing harp, creating a complex and unpredictable rhythmic texture. The impression created by the theme is that an algorithmic compositional process has, like GlaDOS herself, run amok. The theme's chord progression captures several dualities that also help to characterize GlaDOS. First, it features 2 distinct halves, the first of which ends with an elided authentic cadence, and the second of which ends with an elided plagal cadence. This is significant because, as the music theorist Daniel Harrison has shown, plagal and authentic cadences function as opposites. Here's why. An authentic cadence is a phrase-ending harmonic progression from a key's dominant to its tonic, that is, the harmony built on the first tone of the scale. By contrast, a plagal cadence is a phrase-ending harmonic progression from a key's subdominant to its tonic. Since the dominant is the chord built a perfect fifth above the tonic, and the subdominant is the chord built a perfect fifth below the tonic, there is a symmetrical relationship among the chords. Moreover, each cadence relies on what Harrison describes as a functional discharge of characteristic half-step activity. For authentic cadences, this discharge occurs when the first tone of the scale is approached from beneath. And this discharge is so important to the effect of the authentic cadence that composers generally raise the 7th tone of the scale in minor keys to produce it. Compare the effect of an authentic cadence without and with the half-step discharge. For a plagal cadence, the discharge occurs when the 5th tone of the scale is approached from above. Although less ubiquitous than the practice of raising the seventh tone in minor keys, composers often lower the sixth tone of the scale in major mode plagal cadences to heighten the effect of functional discharge. Again, compare the difference between plagal cadences without and with the lowered tone. The functional discharges of these two progressions therefore create another kind of symmetry. Authentic cadences discharge up by half step in resolving to the tonic triad. The cadence is native to major keys, as in minor it requires raising the seventh tone of the scale. The plagal cadence discharges down by half step to arrive on the tonic triad. Native to minor keys, creating this functional discharge in major requires lowering the sixth tone of the scale. 9999999 features alternations of these two dually opposed cadence types, just as the personality of GlaDOS features a conflict between the opposing facets of her human and artificial characteristics. The structure of the chord progression as a whole features a second kind of duality, this one pertaining to what the music theorist Richard Cohn refers to as voice-leading work, which is calculated by counting the total number of combined half steps that each voice must move to transform one sonority into another. To perform this kind of analysis, we need an apples-to-apples comparison. Therefore, we treat the A7 chord as an ornamentation of a basic A major triad. Now, we count the half steps as we move from chord to chord. For example, from D minor to D flat augmented, only one voice needs to move by half step. From D flat augmented to A flat augmented, all three voices must move by one half step each. We calculate the remaining quantities of voice leading work similarly. The first and third voice leadings for both halves of the progression feature smaller quantities of work. Voices move by no more than two half steps, and, by the same token, there is at least one tone common between each chord. By contrast, the central voice leading for each half requires greater quantities of work, and there are no common tones between the two chords. Therefore, each half of the progression features two different kinds of voice leading strategies: low work, which music theorists refer to as conjunct, and high work, which music theorists refer to as disjunct. Taking the progression as a whole, there is a lovely symmetry in the outer voice leadings for each part. One half step then two becomes two half steps then one, which is coupled with two radically different kinds of disjunction in the middle. Viewers with a background in music theory will note that the union of disjunct chords in the first half create a hexatonic collection, whereas the union of disjunct chords in the second half creates a subset of an octatonic collection. Thus, the voice leading for the chord progression for 9999999 features contrasting juxtapositions on several registers: conjunction versus disjunction, symmetry versus asymmetry, and hexatonic versus octatonic. And these contrasting binaries create a musical accompaniment well suited for a narrative of an artificial intelligence with a divided psyche. A third way 9999999 helps tell the game's story is through the particular kinds of fundamental triads it uses: major, minor, and augmented. Many listeners are familiar with the sounds of the major and minor triads, and although for many of us they sound as different from each other as the emotions of happiness and sadness, music theorists often consider them to be instances of the same pitch structure. Here's why. We can build this D major triad by beginning from the lower D and sounding pitches that skip up by 4, 3, and 5 half steps respectively. But if we begin from the upper D and sound pitches that skip down by 4, 3, and 5 half steps, we construct a G minor triad. Another way to visualize this is to imagine a clock face with the 12 notes of the chromatic scale representing each hour. To build a D major triad, we create a scalene triangle with vertices at 12 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and 7 o'clock. Now, if we flip that triangle along the vertical axis, we find that its vertices have landed on 12 o'clock, 5 o'clock, and 8 o'clock, and the circles now encompass the G minor triad. Music theorists call flipping the triangle inversion, and we have just discovered that the D major and G minor triads are inversionally related. Let's construct an augmented triad the same way. We can construct this D augmented sonority by beginning at the lower D and sounding pitches that skip up by regular intervals of 4 half steps each. The fact that the gap from A sharp up to D spans the same number of half steps as the lower 2 intervals, even though it looks different, is a clue that there's something strange about the augmented triad. On the clock face, instead of a scalene triangle, the augmented triad establishes an equilateral triangle with vertices at 12 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and 8 o'clock. When we invert this sonority, we end up exactly where we started. Therefore, augmented triads have very different structures from major and minor triads. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single octave equally divided must produce a sonority in want of consonants. Conversely, consonant sonorities always divide an octave unequally. It is beyond the scope of these videos to explain exactly why that is, but one reason that the asymmetrical major triad sounds so pleasant to our ears is because it approximates the resonances of the natural overtone series. This allows us to interpret the use of major and minor triads in Portal 2 as representing the natural, while the symmetrical augmented triad, constructed algorithmically through the repeated process of stacking tones that are 4 half steps apart, can represent the artificial. Now, in measures 1 and 2, the bells only sound notes that also appear in the harp. But this changes in measure 3, where the bells sound a D-flat minor triad that conflicts with the D-flat augmented triad arpeggiated by the harp. The bell's G natural at the end of measure 4 is best understood as a lower neighbor to an A-flat that appears in measure 5. This melodic juxtaposition of minor and augmented suggests a conceptual juxtaposition of the natural and the artificial, which is the central theme of the game. This reading is amplified when we examine the collections of pitches that appear in the first and then the second half of measure 3. Here is a stack of the notes from the first half of the measure. From bottom to top, the first 2 intervals span 4 half steps each. And we have already discovered that these intervals define the augmented triad. But omitting the lower note, we find that the upper intervals span 4 and 3 half steps respectively. We have already discovered that this pattern of intervals defines a major triad. Therefore, this collection of pitches fuses together the augmented and major triads. The collection of pitches from the second half of the measure outlines the same pattern of intervals, but beginning from different starting places. The sonorities are what music theorists refer to as transpositionally related. In sum, in both the melodic and harmonic dimensions, measure 3 incorporates conflicting chords that present juxtapositions between the natural and the artificial that are thematically aligned with GlaDOS's dichotomous nature, half human, half machine. It is worth lingering on the unusual sonority type produced in measure 3. First, because Moravsky uses it elsewhere in the soundtrack, and we will encounter it again in the second video. But second, because this sonority resembles the famous opening chord from Bernard Herrmann's title music to Vertigo, as do the bell-like arpeggios appearing in changing metrical subdivisions. Indeed, the sonorities are inversionally related, so let's call ours the invertigo chord. In a 2014 interview, Moravsky described the experience of playing Portal 2 as a kind of virtual vertigo, so I asked him whether the musical reference was intended.
Obviously, vertigo was a really clear place that it had been used in the past, particularly with those arpeggios. And so I definitely read the manuscript, and it's a favorite score of mine as well. And Bernard Herrmann is a really big influence kind of across the board.
Thus, the invertigo chord is both meaningful within the narrative of Portal 2 and also serves as a broader cultural reference that identifies the score's lineage in the practice of multimedia musical composition. In this video, we have looked briefly at how some of the compositional details of 9999999 help portray the fractured character of GlaDOS, identifying her as an antagonist defined by her dualities, the machine versus the organic, the rational versus the capricious, and the procedural versus the random. So perhaps we believe the fiction that this music was composed by a digital brain. But if so, we can be confident that it was written by an irrational and unpredictable, and perhaps murderous AI. In the next video, we will explore how 9999999 is developed and transformed in Portal 2's middle act, and how these changes are coordinated with the game designer's iterative approach to teaching the player new gameplay techniques.